If you've ever done the math at 3 in the morning, moving the same numbers around in your head as if this time they might add up differently, this story is for you. There's a particular kind of fear that has nothing to do with how much you have. It's the fear that no matter how much arrives, it will never be enough to make you feel safe. You've felt it. Maybe you're feeling it right now. Today, I want to tell you about a merchant who did something that made an entire city question his sanity. He had built one of the largest fortunes in the region, and one morning he gave it all away. Not some of it, not the excess, all of it. People said he had lost his mind. But there was one detail about that morning that nobody understood until years later, a single choice he made just before he gave the last coin away, and that choice is the reason his name is still spoken today. We'll get to it. First, you need to understand the man he was before that morning, because his fear was not so different from yours. Before we go further, I want to ask you something. Tell me in the comments, if you woke up tomorrow with everything you've ever wanted financially, how long do you think that feeling of safety would actually last? A day? A week? You might be surprised how many people, when they're honest, say the same thing. Not very long at all. The merchant's name was Tarek, and he lived in a trading city built where two rivers met, a place thick with the smell of spice and river silt, where the docks never went quiet even after dark. Tarek had started with nothing but a cart and a talent for knowing which goods a ship would need before the ship's captain knew it himself. By the time he was 40, he owned 5 warehouses, a fleet of boats, and a house with more rooms than he had ever slept in. But Tarek had a habit that his household staff had learned to recognize. Every evening after the ledgers were closed and the last clerk had gone home, he would sit alone in his counting room and add the numbers again. Not because he didn't trust his clerks. He trusted them completely. He added the numbers because some part of him believed that if he stopped checking, even for one night, everything would somehow slip away while he wasn't looking. His wife, a quiet and observant woman named Iset, noticed that Tarek had not taken a full breath in front of her in years. He would exhale, but never all the way. She used to joke that he counted his breathing too, just to make sure none of it went to waste. He would laugh when she said this, but the laugh never quite reached his eyes. What made Tarek's fear so convincing, even to himself, was that it wore the costume of responsibility. He told himself he wasn't afraid. He was simply prudent. He told himself that a man with a family, with workers depending on him, with a city watching his every move, could not afford to feel safe. Safety was for smaller men with smaller obligations. This is the story fear tells when it wants to keep its seat at the table. It never says, "I am afraid." It says, "I am being careful." You may recognize that voice. It is the voice that tells you to check your account balance one more time, even though nothing has changed since the last time you looked 10 minutes ago. It is the voice that turns a comfortable life into a permanent audit. One year, a drought struck inland, and grain prices tripled almost overnight. Tarek's warehouses were full. He could have sold at the new price and doubled his fortune in a single season. His clerks urged him to do it. His competitors were already doing it, and the streets outside the granaries had grown tense with families who could no longer afford bread. But what he didn't know was that his decision that week would be remembered long after the drought itself was forgotten. Tarek stood at the door of his largest warehouse and watched the line of people waiting, some of them families he had done business with for 20 years, and something in him hesitated. Not softened. Hesitated. He sold at the old price, not out of pure generosity, if we're being honest about who Tarek was at that point in the story. He sold at the old price partly because he could not stand the thought of being remembered as the man who profited from hunger. Even his early acts of goodness were still tangled up with his fear of loss. In this case, the loss of his reputation. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Generosity and fear can wear very similar clothes, and it takes time to tell them apart, even in yourself. His fortune grew smaller that season, but his name grew larger. People began to speak of Tarek differently, and this is where everything changed, though not in the way you might expect. The following spring, an old monk arrived at the docks with nothing but a walking staff and a single bowl. He had walked from the mountains, and his reputation had arrived slightly ahead of him. People said this monk asked travelers strange questions and left before they could fully answer. Tarek, curious and perhaps a little vain about his recent reputation for generosity, invited the monk to dine at his house. The dinner was long, and Tarek found himself doing what wealthy men often do in front of monks, listing his good deeds, the grain he had sold at a loss, the workers he had never once let go, even in slow seasons, the temple roof he had quietly repaired. He wanted, if he was honest, some kind of approval. The monk listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Tarek finally finished, the old man asked only one question. When you gave away that grain, whose hunger were you trying to end, theirs or your own? Remember this detail. It matters later. Tarek didn't understand the question, or perhaps he understood it too well and didn't want to. He laughed it off, refilled the monk's cup, and changed the subject. But that night, for the first time in years, he didn't go to his counting room. He lay in bed instead, turning the question over like a stone in his palm, looking for the smooth side and finding none. Over the following months, the question followed him the way certain questions do. Not loudly, but constantly, arriving at strange hours during meetings, during meals, during the quiet seconds before sleep. He began to notice that even his most generous acts still had a transaction hidden inside them. He gave, and some part of him was still counting what the giving earned him. Reputation, comfort, a story he could tell himself about who he was. And this is where everything changed. Tarek started visiting the monk who had taken up residence in a small room near the temple, owning nothing but his bowl, his staff, and one spare robe. Tarek expected to find a man who had renounced comfort and was therefore, in some quiet way, suffering for it. Instead, he found a man who slept easily, who laughed with his whole chest, who ate whatever was placed in his bowl without complaint or craving, and who, strangest of all to Tarek, did not check anything before he slept. Nothing to count, nothing to guard. "How do you sleep?" Tarek finally asked him, owning nothing. The monk smiled, but he did not answer that night. This is a rule you should remember about questions that matter. Sometimes they aren't answered on the night you ask them. They're answered by the life you live afterward. There is a smaller story inside this larger one, and it deserves to be told, because it shows exactly how slowly this kind of change actually happens. Never in one dramatic gesture, no matter what the legends later claimed. A few weeks after that unanswered question, one of Tarek's own ships was lost in a storm off the coast, along with a cargo worth more than most families in the city would see in a lifetime. In the old days, Tarek would have shut himself in the counting room for a week, recalculating losses that no amount of recalculating could undo. This time, he felt the old panic rise in his chest exactly as it always had. But this is where everything changed, quietly, without anyone watching. He noticed the panic. He named it silently as an old visitor rather than an emergency. And then, for the first time in his life, he let it pass through him instead of ruling the rest of his week. His clerks noticed the difference before Iset did, which surprised her when she heard it from them. They said the master had asked about the sailors first, whether all hands had made it to shore safely, before he asked a single question about the cargo. It was a small thing. It would not have made a story on its own. But it was the first time in 20 years that Tarek had put a person's safety ahead of a number in the same breath, without having to think about which one mattered more. Word of this reached the monk, who only nodded when he heard it, as though it confirmed something he had already suspected. Remember this detail. It matters later. The wagers in the city grew louder after that. Merchants who had built their fortunes alongside Tarek began to worry, in the way that comfortable people worry when someone near them starts asking questions they've spent their whole lives avoiding. If Tarek was wrong to have been so afraid all those years, what did that make the rest of them, still adding their numbers each night in rooms of their own? It is a strange thing, but a person's peace can feel like an accusation to everyone who hasn't found theirs yet. Some of Tarek's oldest friends stopped visiting. Others visited more than ever, hoping some of it might be contagious. For nearly a year, Tarek kept visiting, kept giving away pieces of his fortune, first to the temple, then to the families who had waited outside his warehouse that season, then to workers he'd never met. Each time he gave something away, he searched himself honestly for the transaction. Was he doing this to be seen, to be safe, to earn some invisible ledger entry in the sky? Slowly, and only slowly, the transactions grew fewer. The giving began to feel less like spending and more like breathing out. But what he didn't know was that his household and half the city had begun placing wagers on how far this would go. Some said Tarek was performing a very expensive kind of theater that no man built like him could ever truly let go. Others said he had simply lost his mind, that grief or age had softened his judgment. Iset alone said nothing. She had begun, for the first time in their marriage, to hear her husband exhale completely. And then came the morning everyone still talks about. Tarek called his clerks together and instructed them to distribute everything that remained. The warehouses, the boats, the accumulated coin, all of it, to the workers who had built his fortune with him, to the temple, to the families still recovering from the drought years before. Not most of it, all of it. His clerks assumed he had misspoken. He hadn't. Before the last coin left his hands, Tarek did something that almost nobody noticed at the time. And this is the detail that took years for the city to understand. He did not give away the small clay bowl on his writing desk, the one his mother had used to measure rice when he was a child, before he had anything at all. He kept exactly one object, not because it had value, because it reminded him of who he was before the fear started counting for him. That is the whole of it. Not a man who owned nothing, a man who finally knew the difference between what he needed and what fear told him he needed, and who kept precisely enough to remember the difference. That bowl is the 7 words we promised you at the beginning of this story, though they were never spoken aloud. The bowl said them for him. I know now what enough looks like. Here is what Tarek's story is really asking you. It isn't asking you to give away your fortune tomorrow. That would be missing the lesson as badly as the wealthy men who tried to imitate him and only managed to perform generosity for an audience. The lesson is smaller and harder than that. It's asking you to notice the counting room in your own life, the place where you go quietly to check on something that isn't actually going anywhere. That merchant is you every time you refresh your banking app, hoping the number will finally make you feel safe, and it doesn't, and you refresh it again anyway. The philosophical concept underneath this whole story has a name, though Tarek never would have used it. It's called attachment, not to money itself, but to the belief that money is what stands between you and disaster. Attachment doesn't announce itself as fear. It disguises itself as responsibility, as prudence, as the sensible thing a careful person does. And like Tarek, most of us can't see it clearly until someone asks us a question we'd rather not answer. When you're chasing that next number, whose hunger are you actually trying to end? So tonight, here are 3 small things you can do, none of which require you to give away anything you're not ready to give. First, find your own version of Tarek's bowl. Not a metaphor, an actual object, something small that reminds you of a time before the fear started keeping score. Keep it somewhere you'll see it. Let it do a little of the remembering for you. Second, the next time you catch yourself checking a balance, a portfolio, an account, out of anxiety rather than actual need, pause for 10 seconds before you look. Ask yourself Tarek's question in your own words. What am I hoping this number will do for me that it has never actually done before? Third, before you sleep tonight, write down 3 things you already own that no amount of money could buy or replace. And notice how strange it feels that these are rarely the things your fear asks you to protect. Picture Tarek in his final years, sitting outside a small house near the temple as the sun goes down. That same clay bowl on the table beside him, empty of rice, but full of something else entirely. He isn't rich anymore, not by any measure the city once used to admire him. But for the first time since he was a boy pushing a cart through the docks, he breathes all the way out. In his own words, spoken once to a young clerk who asked why a man so respected lived so simply, Tarek said only this: I didn't lose my fortune. I finally stopped mistaking it for my safety. And that is really the whole of it, for him and for you. The number was never going to be the thing that made you feel safe. Something else was always going to have to do that instead. If this story gave you even a single moment of that same breath, the full one, all the way out, there are more stories like it waiting for you here. Next time, I want to tell you about a debtor who was offered a way to erase everything he owed in a single night, and the strange condition he was given in return, one that made him hesitate longer than the debt itself ever had. Until then, walk gently, hold loosely.